The light was dying when it happened. That particular winter light that never quite arrives, never quite leaves, just hangs suspended between afternoon and evening like a held breath. I was standing in my hallway, one hand pressed against the doorframe, feeling the weight of the day settle into my shoulders the way it always did. The radiator hissed its familiar complaint from the corner, a sound I'd grown so accustomed to that its absence would have been louder than its presence. Rowan was across from me, leaning against the entrance to my kitchen, and I could smell the faint trace of coffee still lingering in the air from earlier. We had been talking about something ordinary. I can't remember what now, but I remember the way his voice had grown quieter as the light faded, the way conversations do when day becomes night and everything feels more fragile, more honest. He had gone still in that doorway, his eyes moving between my face and the worn hardwood floor beneath our feet. There was something in his expression I had never seen before, or perhaps something I had seen but never allowed myself to recognize. A kind of uncertainty that seemed foreign on him. This man who worked with his hands and trusted wood to hold under pressure and knew the exact angle needed to make a joint that would last decades. "I can't explain it," he said, and his voice was so low I almost didn't catch the words. They seemed to cost him something to say, as if each syllable required a decision he hadn't been sure he was ready to make. Then he moved toward me, not quickly, not with any sudden urgency, but with the deliberate slowness of someone who understands that some actions cannot be undone. His hand rose, and I watched it approach as if time had stretched thin between us, as if the air itself had thickened to amber. His fingers touched my forehead, brushing my hair back in a gesture so gentle it felt like a question being asked without words. Something inside me shifted. It was such a small thing, really. The kind of touch you might give a child before bedtime, or a gesture shared between people who had known each other for years rather than months. But there was nothing casual about it, nothing accidental. His fingertips traced along my hairline with a reverence that made my chest tight. I felt the calluses on his hands, earned from years of working with wooden tools, felt the careful way he moved, as if he were handling something precious and breakable. The touch lasted perhaps 3 seconds, maybe 4, but in that brief span, I felt something inside me that I had kept carefully locked away begin to stir. When his hand fell back to his side, the absence of it felt like a physical ache. The space between us seemed to vibrate with what had just passed, and I found myself struggling to remember how to breathe normally. We stood there in the fading light, neither of us speaking, neither of us moving, as if we both understood that something fundamental had shifted and we needed a moment to find our footing in this new landscape. I thought about the last time someone had touched me like that. Not the mechanical interactions of daily life, the accidental brush of shoulders in a crowded store, or the brief contact of hands when passing papers to a student, but a touch that meant something. A touch that carried intention and tenderness, and the kind of careful attention that says you matter to me in a way I cannot put into words. It had been years. Long enough that I had convinced myself I didn't miss it, didn't need it. Long enough that I had built a life around its absence, filled my days with routines and responsibilities that left little room for the kind of longing that Rowan's simple gesture had just awakened. He was looking at me now with those dark eyes that always seemed to see more than I was comfortable showing. There was something vulnerable in his expression, as if he too was surprised by what he had done, by the impulse that had moved through him without permission. We had been friends for months, meeting regularly at the community center, sharing conversations that stretched longer than necessary, finding excuses to spend time in each other's company. But this was different. This was a line crossed, a door opened that neither of us had acknowledged was there. The radiator hissed again, and somewhere in the distance I could hear the muffled sounds of my neighbors going about their evening routines. The ordinary world continuing around us while we stood frozen in this moment that felt anything but ordinary. I wanted to say something to acknowledge what had just happened, but the words seemed inadequate. How do you name something you're not sure you're ready to face? Rowan's hands hung at his sides now, but I could still feel the ghost of his touch on my skin, still feel the way his fingers had moved through my hair with such careful attention, as if he were memorizing the texture, the way it fell across my forehead. There was something in that gesture that spoke of longing held in check, of feelings that had been building slowly, quietly, like water rising behind a dam. I realized I was trembling just slightly, not from the cold, though my apartment was never quite warm enough in these winter months. This was something else entirely, something that started deep in my chest and radiated outward until I felt unsteady on my feet. It was the trembling that comes with recognition, with the sudden understanding that your life has just changed in a way you cannot undo. We stood there as the last light faded completely from the windows, as the familiar sounds of evening settled around us. Two men in a narrow hallway, the space between them charged with possibility and fear in equal measure. I knew that whatever came next, we could not go back to the careful friendship we had built, the safe distance we had maintained. That single, gentle touch had changed everything, had opened something between us that would demand to be acknowledged. And in the growing darkness, with the scent of coffee still faint in the air and the radiator keeping its steady rhythm, I found myself both terrified and grateful that he had been brave enough to reach for me, to cross that invisible line that had kept us safely separate. Because even in my fear, I could feel something else stirring, something that felt suspiciously like hope. The morning after Rowan touched my hair, I woke before my alarm and lay in bed listening to the familiar sounds of my carefully constructed life. The coffee maker clicking on at 6:15, programmed the night before. The neighbor upstairs running water through pipes that had been carrying the same rhythm for decades. The distant hum of traffic beginning to build on Route 1 as the town stirred itself awake. I had built my life around these sounds, these patterns, these small certainties that asked nothing of me beyond showing up. For 7 years, I had taught American history at Millfield High, walking the same route through town each morning, past the harbor where lobster boats rocked against their moorings and the fog clung to the water like something reluctant to let go. The school sat on a hill overlooking the bay, a brick building from the 1930s that smelled perpetually of floor wax and adolescent anxiety. My students knew me as Mr. Price, the teacher who wore the same rotation of button-down shirts and kept his desk organized with the precision of someone who understood that chaos lived just beneath the surface of things, waiting for an invitation. I taught them about the Revolutionary War and the Great Depression and the slow march of progress that had brought us to this moment, this place, this version of America where a man could teach high school history in a small Maine town and ask for nothing more. My apartment reflected the same careful order. 2 bedrooms, though I used the second as an office, filled with stacks of papers to grade and books that leaned against each other like old friends. The living room held a couch I had bought secondhand, a coffee table marked with ring stains from previous owners, and bookshelves that climbed the walls in neat columns. Everything had its place. Everything served a purpose. Everything was safe. It was a life that fit me like a sweater worn soft with washing, comfortable and unremarkable in mine. I walked to work because the distance was manageable and because walking gave me time to prepare for the day ahead. I made the same breakfast each morning because deciding what to eat felt like an unnecessary complication. I attended trivia night at Flanagan Pub every Thursday with my colleagues because they expected me there and because the alternative was an evening alone with only my books and the radiator's steady complaint for company. But Rowan had appeared in this carefully ordered world like a question I hadn't known I was asking. I first met him at the community center on a Tuesday evening in October, when the leaves were just beginning to turn and the air carried the first promise of winter. I had been volunteering there for 3 years, helping to organize the monthly craft fairs and the occasional lecture series, tasks that felt manageable and finite and good. The kind of civic involvement that made me feel connected to something larger without requiring too much of myself. He had walked into the meeting late, apologizing in that quiet way of his, and taken a seat near the back of the room. Tall and lean, with dark hair that looked like he cut it himself, and hands that bore the evidence of physical work. He wore a flannel shirt that had seen better years and jeans faded soft at the knees, and when he introduced himself as Rowan Ellison, recently returned to Millfield, his voice carried an accent I couldn't quite place. After the meeting, I learned he was a carpenter, that he had spent the last 15 years moving from place to place, following work and seasons and something he couldn't quite name. He had grown up in Millfield, but left at 18, and now, at 33, he had come back to the house his grandmother had left him, a small cape on Harbor Street with good bones and a workshop in the converted garage. We began talking in the way that people do when they discover an unexpected compatibility. He would linger after meetings, helping stack chairs or sweep floors, and our conversations would stretch beyond what politeness required. He told me about the years he had spent in Alaska, working construction during the brief summer months, and reading by kerosene lamp through the endless winters. About the time he had driven his truck through the Pacific Northwest, stopping in small towns that reminded him of Millfield, always moving before the feeling of belonging could take hold. There was something restless in him, something that seemed to vibrate just beneath his quiet exterior. But when he talked about woodworking, about the satisfaction of taking a piece of raw lumber and shaping it into something useful and beautiful, his voice grew steady. His hands, which always seemed to carry the scent of cedar and sawdust, would move as he talked, sketching shapes in the air. I found myself looking forward to those Tuesday meetings in a way that surprised me. Found myself taking longer routes through town on the chance I might see his truck parked outside the hardware store or catch a glimpse of him loading lumber at the building supply yard. It was a small thing, this anticipation, but it added a texture to my days that had been missing without my realizing it. When he invited me to see his workshop for the first time, I accepted without hesitation, though I couldn't have said why. Perhaps it was the way he had asked, almost shyly, as if the invitation itself was a kind of vulnerability. Or perhaps it was simply that I had grown curious about the place where his restless energy found focus, where his hands created something lasting from raw materials. That was how it began. Not with grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but with small kindnesses and conversations that lasted longer than they needed to. With the gradual recognition that his presence in my carefully ordered life was becoming something I counted on, something that made the familiar rhythms of my days feel less like routine and more like choice. The invitation came on a Thursday evening in November after a community center meeting that had run longer than usual. We were standing in the parking lot, our breath visible in small clouds as we talked about nothing particularly important, when Rowan glanced toward his truck and then back at me with that hesitant expression I was beginning to recognize. "I need a ride tonight," I had mentioned almost casually. My car had been making a grinding sound that morning, and I had decided to walk rather than risk breaking down on one of the back roads that led to my apartment. Rowan offered immediately, as I had somehow known he would. His pickup truck was old but well-maintained, the interior smelling faintly of sawdust and coffee from a travel mug that had seen better years. The roads were slick with the first real snow of the season, and he drove with the careful attention of someone who understood that winter in Maine required respect. When we reached my building, I thanked him and reached for the door handle, but something in his posture made me pause. He was gripping the steering wheel, staring through the windshield at the falling snow, and I could sense him working up to something. "You know," he said finally, "I've been working on this piece in my shop. A rocking chair." He glanced at me sideways, almost shy. "It's better when someone else looks at it before I finish. Someone with fresh eyes." I accepted without really thinking about it, though later I would wonder what had made the decision so easy. Perhaps it was simple curiosity, or perhaps it was the way he had asked, as if my opinion might actually matter to him. We arranged that I would stop by after school the following Friday, and as I walked up to my apartment, I found myself looking forward to it in a way that felt both natural and surprising. His workshop occupied the converted garage behind his grandmother's house, a small Cape Cod with weathered shingles and windows that glowed warm against the November darkness. When I arrived that Friday, he led me through a side door into a space that seemed to exist outside of time. The workshop was warm, heated by a small wood stove in one corner, and the air hummed with the gentle sound of the space heater working to chase away the chill. Everything smelled of cedar and pine, of wood shavings and the oil he used to treat his tools. The walls were lined with hand tools arranged with the same careful precision I brought to my classroom, each chisel and plane and saw occupying its designated place. Lumber was stacked along one wall in neat piles, organized by type and thickness. A workbench dominated the center of the space, its surface scarred and stained from years of use, and beside it sat the rocking chair he had mentioned. It was nearly finished, the wood smooth and golden in the lamplight. Each curve had been shaped by hand, each joint fitted with the kind of precision that comes only from patience and skill. I ran my fingers along the arm, feeling the grain beneath the surface, the way that would seem to flow in one continuous line from the high back down to the rockers that would carry its motion. "It's beautiful," I told him and meant it. There was something about the chair that spoke of permanence, of craftsmanship in an age of disposable things. It would last decades, maybe longer, carrying whoever sat in it through countless evenings of quiet contemplation. Rowan seemed pleased by my reaction, though he pointed out small imperfections I couldn't see, adjustments he still wanted to make. We talked about the wood he had chosen, the techniques he had learned from his grandfather, the satisfaction of creating something useful with his own hands. His voice grew animated as he described the process, and I found myself watching his hands as he gestured, noting the way they moved with unconscious grace. That visit stretched into 3 hours without either of us noticing. We talked about books we had read, about places we had dreamed of visiting but never had, about the difference between living somewhere and truly belonging there. He made coffee in a percolator that sat on a hot plate, and we drank it from mismatched mugs while snow continued to fall outside the single window. When I finally said I should go, Rowan walked me to the door and then hesitated, his hand on the knob. "You can come back," he said, "if you want. If you're interested in seeing how it turns out." I told him I would like that, and I meant it more than I had expected to. There was something about the workshop that felt suspended from the rest of the world, a place where time moved differently and conversations could unfold without the usual constraints of politeness or social expectation. It felt like a space that belonged only to him, and by extension, only to us. That began a pattern that would define the weeks that followed. I started stopping by after school, sometimes bringing sandwiches or coffee, sometimes helping with small tasks that required an extra pair of hands. I learned to sand wood properly, to recognize the grain and work with it rather than against it. I learned the names of his tools and the specific purpose each one served. More than that, I learned about Rowan himself, about the restlessness that had kept him moving for 15 years, the way he felt most settled when his hands were busy with creation, about the months he had spent alone in his truck, driving through landscapes that stretched empty to every horizon, always searching for something he couldn't name. The workshop became our sanctuary, a place where we could exist outside the careful boundaries I had built around my life, where conversations could meander and silences could stretch comfortable between us, filled only with the sound of sandpaper against wood or the gentle hiss of the space heater, where I began to understand that the careful order of my days might not be enough anymore. The changes began so gradually that I almost didn't notice them first. Small shifts in the rhythm of my days, adjustments so subtle they felt like natural evolution rather than conscious choice. It was only looking back that I could see how Rowan's presence had begun to alter the very texture of my carefully ordered life. The walk to the community center, which had always been simply a means of getting from one place to another, started to feel different on Tuesday evenings. My steps would quicken slightly as I approached the building, and I would find myself scanning the parking lot for his truck before I even realized what I was doing. The meetings themselves took on a new quality when I knew he would be there, his quiet presence in the back of the room somehow making the discussions more interesting. The time passed more quickly. I began cooking differently without quite understanding why. For years, I had prepared simple meals for one, efficient combinations of protein and vegetables that required minimal effort and produced minimal waste. But suddenly, I found myself making larger portions, claiming it was for leftovers, but knowing even as I stirred an extra serving of pasta or seasoned a second chicken breast that the surplus had a destination in mind. The first time I brought food to the workshop, I told myself it was simple practicality. I had made too much chili, and it seemed wasteful to throw it away. Rowan accepted the container with a grateful smile, and the kind of appreciation that suggested he often forgot to eat proper meals when he was focused on his work. We shared it sitting on crates beside the workbench, talking about the progress he was making on the rocking chair, and something about the domesticity of the moment felt both foreign and deeply right. After that, it became a regular occurrence. I would arrive at the workshop with thermoses of soup or sandwiches wrapped in brown paper, and we would eat together while he showed me what he had accomplished since my last visit. These meals felt different from the solitary dinners I was accustomed to, charged with the intimacy I hadn't experienced in years. The simple act of sharing food seemed to create a bond between us that went beyond friendship, though I wasn't ready to examine what that might mean. Rowan began sharing more of himself during these evenings together. He told me about the years he had spent in Alaska, working on fishing boats during the salmon runs and construction crews during the brief summer months when the ground thawed enough to pour foundations. He described the long winters when darkness stretched for 18 hours and the only sound was wind across the tundra, how he had read by kerosene lamp and learned to find companionship in solitude. He talked about the restlessness that had driven him from place to place, the inability to settle that had become as much a part of his identity as his skill with wood. He had tried to put down roots in various towns across the Pacific Northwest, he told me, but something always pulled him onward. A job opportunity, a change in seasons, or simply the feeling that he was wearing out his welcome in someone else's space. But there was something different about being back in Millfield, he said one evening while sanding the curved back of the rocking chair. Something he couldn't quite put into words. The movements of his hands were hypnotic as he worked, the sandpaper whispering against the wood grain, and I found myself watching the concentration on his face as he spoke. "What's it like," he asked without looking up from his work, "to feel settled? To know you belong somewhere?" The question caught me off guard, partly because I wasn't sure I had ever felt truly settled despite the 7 years I'd spent in the same apartment, the same job, the same routines. I had built a life that looked stable from the outside, but stability and belonging were different things entirely. Stability was about maintaining equilibrium, about keeping chaos at bay through careful planning and consistent habits. Belonging was something else, something that had to do with being seen and accepted and valued for who you actually were rather than who you had decided it was safe to be. I don't know if I've ever felt that way, I told him honestly. The words surprised me as I spoke them, revealing a truth I hadn't fully acknowledged to myself. My life in Millfield had been carefully constructed around safety and predictability, but it had never felt like home in a way that word was meant to be understood. It was a place I lived, not a place I belonged. Rowan stopped sanding and looked at me directly, his dark eyes serious in the lamplight. There was something in his expression that suggested he understood exactly what I meant, that he recognized the difference between existing somewhere and truly inhabiting it. We sat in comfortable silence for several minutes. The only sounds the gentle hiss of the space heater and the distant murmur of wind through the bare branches outside. That conversation marked something between us, though I couldn't have said exactly what. A recognition, perhaps, that we were both searching for something we had never quite been able to name. A sense that the careful boundaries we had each built around ourselves might not be as necessary as we had believed them to be. In the days that followed, I found myself thinking about belonging in ways I never had before, about the difference between the life I had constructed and the life I might actually want, about whether it was possible to want something you had never allowed yourself to imagine, and what it might cost to reach for it. The workshop had become a place outside of time for both of us, a space where we could exist without the usual constraints and expectations that shaped our days, where conversations could unfold naturally and silences could stretch without discomfort, where I was beginning to understand that the careful order of my life, while safe, might also be a kind of prison I had built for myself without realizing it. It happened on a Wednesday evening in December, 3 weeks after our conversation about belonging. The rocking chair was nearly finished, its surface smooth as silk under Rowan's patient hands, and winter had settled over Millfield with the kind of cold that made every breath visible and every surface brittle with frost. I had invited him to my apartment for dinner, a simple gesture that felt both natural and slightly dangerous, as if I were crossing an invisible line I had drawn around my private space. He arrived just as the sun was disappearing behind the harbor, carrying a bottle of wine and wearing the same old coat he had worn since I'd known him, its sleeves slightly frayed at the cuffs. I had spent longer than usual preparing the meal, a beef stew that had been simmering since morning, filling the apartment with warmth and the kind of domestic comfort I rarely bothered to create for myself alone. We ate at my small kitchen table, the conversation flowing as easily as it always did between us. He told me about a commission he had received to build a dining table for a family in Bar Harbor, how they wanted something that would last generations and hold the weight of holiday gatherings and everyday meals alike. I talked about my students, about the way they struggled to understand that history wasn't just dates and battles, but the accumulated weight of individual choices, small decisions that rippled forward through time. The wine sat between us, barely touched, though I noticed how it caught the lamplight and threw small amber reflections across the table. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, the flakes visible through my kitchen window like a curtain being slowly drawn across the evening. Everything felt suspended, held in that particular quiet that comes with new snow and warm rooms and the kind of conversation that seems to exist outside of ordinary time. After we finished eating, we moved to the living room, settling into the comfortable silence that had become natural between us. I had put on music, something soft and instrumental that filled the spaces between our words without demanding attention. Rowan sat in my reading chair, his long legs stretched out before him, looking more relaxed than I had ever seen him. There was something different about him that evening, something settled in a way that reminded me of our conversation about belonging. We had been talking about books, about a novel we had both read that dealt with the weight of family history and the ways people carry their ancestors' choices forward into their own lives. The conversation had grown quieter as the evening progressed, more contemplative, the way discussions do when wine and warmth and the intimacy of a small space combine to lower the usual barriers people maintain between themselves and the world. I was telling him about a student who had written an essay about her grandmother's immigration to America, how she had captured something essential about the courage required to leave everything familiar behind in search of something better. As I spoke, I noticed Rowan watching me with an intensity that made me suddenly self-conscious, as if he were seeing something in me that I hadn't intended to reveal. When I finished the story, he was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between my face and his hands, which were clasped loosely in his lap. The silence stretched between us, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt pregnant with possibility, charged with something neither of us had quite named. "I can't explain it," he said finally, his voice so low I almost missed the words. He seemed to be speaking more to himself than to me, as if he were working through something he hadn't fully understood until that moment. Then he stood and moved toward where I sat on the couch. Not quickly, but with the deliberate slowness of someone who has made a decision and is committed to seeing it through. I watched him approach, my heart beginning to beat faster, though I couldn't have said exactly why. There was something in his expression that I had never seen before, a kind of vulnerability mixed with determination that made my breath catch. When he reached me, he paused, standing close enough that I could smell the faint scent of sawdust that always seemed to cling to his clothes, could see the small scar on his left hand where a chisel had slipped years ago in Alaska. His eyes met mine, dark and serious, and in them I saw a question being asked without words. Then his hand rose, slowly, carefully, as if he were handling something precious and fragile. When his fingers touched my forehead, brushing my hair back from my face, the gesture was so gentle it felt like a benediction. His touch traced along my hairline with a reverence that made my chest tight, and I felt the calluses on his fingertips, earned from years of working with wood, felt the careful way he moved, as if he were afraid I might break. The touch lasted only seconds, but in that brief span something inside me that I had kept carefully locked away for years began to stir. It was such a simple gesture, really the kind of touch you might give someone you loved without thinking about it. But there was nothing casual about this, nothing accidental. When his hand fell back to his side, the absence of it felt like a physical ache. We stood there in the lamplight, neither of us speaking, neither of us moving, as if we both understood that something fundamental had shifted between us and we needed a moment to find our footing in this new landscape we had stumbled into. I thought about the last time someone had touched me like that, with such careful attention and tenderness. It had been years, long enough that I had convinced myself I didn't miss it, didn't need it, long enough that I had built a life around its absence. But Rowan's simple gesture had awakened something in me that refused to be ignored, something that whispered that perhaps the careful walls I had built around my heart were not protection, but prison. The days after that evening in my apartment passed with a strange quality, as if time itself had shifted gear and was moving at a different speed. Rowan and I continued our routine of meeting at the workshop, but something had changed in the air between us. There was a new awareness, a heightened sensitivity to each other's presence that made even ordinary conversations feel charged with unspoken meaning. He was quieter than usual, more focused on his work, and I caught him watching me sometimes with an expression I couldn't quite read. The rocking chair was nearly complete, requiring only the final sanding and the application of the oil that would bring out the grain and protect the wood for years to come. But where before he had worked with his usual steady confidence, now there was something restless in his movements, as if his hands couldn't quite settle into their familiar rhythm. I found myself walking past his house on routes that had no logical purpose, hoping to see his truck in the driveway or catch a glimpse of him loading lumber at the building supply yard. These detours felt foolish even as I made them, but I couldn't seem to stop myself. Something about the touch we had shared, the vulnerability I had seen in his eyes, had left me hungry for reassurance that what had passed between us was real and not simply my imagination giving substance to wishful thinking. When I arrived at the workshop on Friday evening, 3 days after our dinner, I found him standing at the workbench, but not working. Instead, he was pacing the small space with the kind of restless energy I'd seen in him before, but amplified, more urgent. The rocking chair sat finished beside him, its surface gleaming with the oil he had applied that morning, but he seemed oblivious to its completion. Something was wrong. I could see it in the tension of his shoulders, the way his hands moved through his hair, the careful distance he maintained between us when usually our conversations drew us naturally closer together. When I asked if everything was all right, he stopped pacing and looked at me with an expression that held equal parts regret and resolution. "I've been thinking about leaving," he said, the words falling between us like stones dropped into still water. "Going back to Alaska, maybe down in North Carolina where there's work-building boats." His voice was steady, but I could hear the effort it cost him to keep it that way. The words hit me with a force I hadn't expected. In the weeks since we had begun spending time together, I had grown so accustomed to his presence in my life that the possibility of his absence felt like contemplating the loss of something essential. But more than that, I could hear in his voice the same pattern he had described to me before, the restlessness that had kept him moving for 15 years, always leaving before the feeling of belonging could take hold. Why? I asked, though I thought I already knew the answer. It had to do with what had happened between us, with the line we had crossed, and the vulnerability we had both revealed. It had to do with the way he had touched my hair and the way I had let him, the way we had stood afterward in the charged silence of recognition. He was quiet for a long time, his gaze moving between my face and the finished chair that represented months of careful work. "I never stay anywhere long," he said finally. "It's what I do. I come to a place, I work for a while, and then I move on before things get complicated, before I want something I can't keep." The honesty in his voice was devastating. I could see the internal battle playing out in his expression, the pull between the safety of his familiar patterns and whatever it was he felt for me. He was afraid, I realized, not of the feelings themselves, but of the possibility that they might not be sustainable, that wanting something permanent would only lead to the kind of loss he had spent years teaching himself to avoid. But what if he could keep it? I heard myself saying, the words emerging without conscious decision. What if staying was an option? He looked at me, then with such raw vulnerability that I felt something shift inside my chest. This was the moment I understood when everything would be decided, when we would either acknowledge what was growing between us or let it slip away into the realm of might-have-beens. "I don't want you to go," I said, the admission feeling both terrifying and inevitable. Not because of the chair or the friendship, but because you've become part of my life in a way no one else has. Because these evenings in the workshop, these conversations, this feeling of being understood by someone, it's changed something in me that I can't change back. The silence that followed felt endless, though it probably lasted only seconds. Rowan's hands had gone still at his sides, and I could see him processing what I had said, weighing it against his own fears and the patterns that had governed his adult life. When he finally moved, it was slowly, deliberately, stepping closer until he was standing within arm's reach. His hands rose to rest briefly on my shoulders, and I could feel the slight tremor in his fingers. The way his touch seemed to be testing whether this space between us could bear the weight of what we were both feeling. There was a question in his eyes, the same one I'd seen the night he touched my hair, but now it carried more weight, more consequence. "I'm scared," he said quietly, and the admission seemed to cost him something. "I've never let myself want something this much. I don't know how to do this, how to stay in one place and believe it could work." But he was still standing there, his hands still resting on my shoulders, and in his touch, I could feel the decision being made. The choice to try, despite his fear. The recognition that some things might be worth the risk of staying for. A week passed before I returned to the workshop, 7 days during which I gave Rowan the space I sensed he needed to wrestle with his decision. I continued my routine of walking to school and grading papers and attending my Thursday trivia night at Flanagan. But everything felt different now, suspended between what had been and what might yet become. I found myself checking my phone for messages that didn't come, driving past his house on unnecessary errands, searching for signs of whether he was still there or if he had loaded his truck and disappeared into the anonymous vastness of the interstate. When I finally knocked on the workshop door that Friday evening, my heart was beating with the irregular rhythm of someone who wasn't sure what answer he wanted to the question he was about to ask. Rowan opened the door immediately, as if he had been waiting for me, and the relief in his eyes told me everything I needed to know before either of us spoke a word. The rocking chair sat in the center of the workshop, no longer on the workbench, but placed on the floor where it could fulfill its intended purpose. The wood gleamed with the deep luster that came from multiple coats of oil, each grain line visible beneath the surface like the map of some beautiful, undiscovered country. It was finished completely and perfectly finished, and seeing it there in its full glory took my breath away. "It's done," he said, though I could see that for myself. There was something in his voice I hadn't heard before, a quiet satisfaction mixed with something that might have been pride. Not the sharp pride of ego, but the deeper satisfaction that comes from creating something lasting with your own hands, something that will outlive the person who made it. I approached the chair slowly, running my fingers along the smooth curve of the armrest, feeling the way Rowan's hands had shaped every surface until it achieved this state of perfect functionality. It was beautiful in the way that simple, well-made things are beautiful without ornamentation or pretense, designed to serve its purpose with grace and endurance. "Try it," he said, and there was something almost shy in the invitation, as if he were offering me something more than just a place to sit. I settled into the chair, carefully, feeling the way it accepted my weight, and began to move in response to the slightest shift of my body. The motion was smooth, hypnotic, the kind of gentle rhythm that could soothe a crying child or calm an anxious mind. The seat fit me perfectly, as if it had been designed with my specific proportions in mind, and I found myself thinking about all the evenings this chair would hold, all the quiet moments it would witness. Rowan watched me from where he leaned against his workbench, his arms crossed, but his posture relaxed in a way I hadn't seen since the night we had dinner in my apartment. There was something settled about him, some internal tension finally resolved, and I realized that finishing the chair had been about more than completing a piece of furniture. It had been about proving to himself that he could see something through to its conclusion, that not everything in his life had to be temporary. The radio played softly in the background, a classical station that filled the workshop with the kind of music that seemed designed for winter evenings and lamplight and the particular intimacy of shared silence. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, the flakes visible through the single window like a benediction on the evening, and I could hear the distant sound of wine through the bare branches of the oak tree that shaded the workshop in summer. We stayed like that for a long time, me rocking gently in the chair he had made, him watching from across the small space that had become our sanctuary. There was something peaceful about the moment, something that felt like an ending and a beginning simultaneously. The frantic energy that had characterized our last conversation was gone, replaced by a quieter certainty that felt more sustainable, more real. Eventually, Rowan pushed himself away from the workbench and moved toward me, not with the hesitant uncertainty that had marked our previous encounters, but with the deliberate purpose of someone who has made a decision and is at peace with its consequences. When he reached me, he didn't speak. Instead, he reached forward and brushed my hair back from my forehead in the same gentle motion he had used that first time. But now there was no hesitation in the gesture, no question being asked. This time, he left his hand there for a moment longer, his palm warm against my temple, his thumb tracing a small circle near my hairline. It was such a simple touch, but it carried the weight of everything we had shared, everything we had risked, everything we had chosen to build together despite our fears. I covered his hand with mine, holding it in place, and in that moment, I felt something I had never experienced before. Not just the physical comfort of being touched with tenderness, but something deeper. The sense of being truly seen by another person, of being valued not despite my carefully constructed defenses, but because he had looked past them to whatever lay beneath. Neither of us spoke. The words we might have said seemed inadequate to the moment, too small to hold what we were both feeling. Instead, we existed in the space between heartbeats, in the gentle rhythm of the rocking chair and the soft fall of snow outside, and the quiet certainty that whatever came next, we would face it together. The scene held like that as the evening deepened around us. The warmth of the workshop keeping the winter at bay, the scent of cedar and sawdust mixing with the possibility of everything we had yet to discover about each other, about ourselves, about what it meant to choose love over fear and staying over leaving, and the beautiful, terrifying vulnerability of building something meant to last.